stewardship, investment, and charity. The concept of Christian stewardship is a fundamental tenet of the Christian social order. The Bible declares that God is the sovereign owner of all his creation. He delegated the responsibility for the care of the earth to Adam, the representative head of mankind. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Throughout the Bible, man is cautioned to exercise dominion over the earth in terms of God's requirements. God's law order is the means by which man is to bring the earth into subjection. Any deviation from this law order involves man in rebellion against God and the destruction of God's property. The great enemy of God, Satan, is pictured in the parable of the tares as the one who violates the rules of planting in order to defy God and to thwart God's plan. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 following. The parable of the husbandman who prepared his vineyard and then turned it over to servants who proved to be unfaithful thieves indicates the hostility of God against those who would violate his rights of ownership. Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 and following. The faithful steward is he who treats God's universe with respect, causing it to flower and grow in productivity. He is the one who invests his Lord's money wisely, turning an honest profit, expanding the value of the goods entrusted to him. Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 following. Yet he is also a man who should be merciful in his dealings with others, as God has been merciful to him. Matthew chapter 18, verse 23 following. Faithful stewardship therefore involves, at the minimum, the following. 1. A recognition of the sovereignty of God over his creation. 2. Obedience to the law order God has established for the governing of his creation. 3. The productive, fruitful administration of one's vocation or calling. 4. The recognition of the lawfulness of the tithe in theory and practice. 5. The voluntary giving of alms on a selective, godly basis. Stewardship can be summarized into two overarching principles: calling and charity. The first of the 5 aspects of stewardship, the recognition of the sovereignty of God, is the foundation of both the calling and charity. Charity and calling are linked, and yet they are separate. The principle enunciated by Jesus, "Unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required," indicates the link. Luke chapter 12, verse 48b. God grants plenty to men, his vicegerents on earth, but he expects honesty and charity from them. Men are warned specifically against the great danger of benefiting from the open hand of God, only to forget the sovereign demands of the giver. Destruction will be the result. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 11 following. But the distinction between investment and usury stands as a reminder against the fusing of charity into the realm of the calling. One may not make a living through loans to needy brothers. Such a living is an abomination in the sight of God. It is not the case, as one advocate of a totally laissez-faire free market has attempted to argue, that the best form of charity is a profit-making investment in capital which will create jobs. To accept that premise, the Christian would have to blur the God-given distinctions between business and voluntary charity. Business involves an economic return, or at least a potential for making a profit, to the investor. Charity involves the transfer of scarce economic resources to another with no thought of return. Matthew chapter 10, verse 8, Luke chapter 6, verse 35. A man can hardly call himself a faithful steward if he seals off charity from business in an absolute manner. Businesses are supposed to earn profits if they are to be successful, as several parables of Jesus indicate. However, ruthless competition that is utterly devoid of mercy is also condemned in the parables. But the fact that a particular young ruler was told to sell all of his goods and give everything to the poor does not stand as a requirement for every steward. Nor does the example of the church at Jerusalem in Acts chapter 4, verse 32 prevail as a model for all churches. A man must be careful not to drown out the revelation of God in his word, listening only to the parables of profit or only to the examples of total poverty. He is responsible before God to respond to the leading of God's Spirit at different times and along each turn in life's path. We are warned to grow spiritually by means of earthly parables of economic stewardship. The fact that God may demand a man to give up all that he has does not imply that God is sanctioning the moral validity of continual economic losses. What God is saying is that one must not be morally ruthless in business, nor morally wasteful in charity. Share the wealth is a biblical principle, and the normal means of this sharing is the tithe. The general principle is not destroy all wealth through universal, indiscriminate giving. In short, business is not charity, though it may be and should be merciful. Charity should be carefully administered in a business-like fashion, with honest accounting, budgeting, etc., but it is not a business, that is, not a profit-making economic endeavour. They are separate, sovereign realms. Their differences must be respected. One important difference is in the very bureaucratic structure produced by each form of stewardship. Professor Mises has distinguished two basic models of management. The first is the business form, the one geared to profit and loss statements. It will be characterized by a central entrepreneurial hierarchy that makes the basic decisions as to general goals of the corporation. These goals are transmitted to the lower ranks by professional managers who earn a salary, but who do not participate in the true economic profits. Profits are the residuals left after all costs are met: taxes, salaries, interest, raw materials. It is a residual based on the accurate forecasting of formerly unknown events. Superior forecasters of the future reap profits, while the less efficient take losses. The lower ranks of the bureaucracy are left relatively free to do whatever turns a profit in each subdivision within the general goals of the company. There is far more flexibility at the lower levels precisely because the magnitude of profit and loss is not rigidly fixed in advance. In contrast to this flexible, risk-oriented, free market management is the government bureaucracy, or the non-profit charities bureaucratic structure. They are on fixed allocations determined by taxpayers or givers. These bureaucracies have far less flexible budgets, for they are financed from above. They do not make profits and they do not sustain losses, at least not in the sense of the profits and losses sustained by a firm in a competitive market. The only way to increase revenues is to get more money from the taxpayers or the donors. This kind of bureaucracy allows far less freedom to lower echelon bureaucrats to spend as they please. They must follow carefully delineated budgets that are fixed in advance. These men are less flexible than their free market counterparts because their budgets are centrally directed, far less flexible, and, as a result, the men involved are not subject to the direct competition of the market. To a limited extent, the tax law structure of the United States acknowledges the validity of both Mises' analysis and the biblical separation of business and charity. Non-profit corporations are supposed to be essentially charitable, educational, eleemosynary, service-oriented, cultural, etc. And employees are just that, salaried employees. They are paid in terms of services rendered to the functioning of the corporation. They are not allowed to receive all residuals after all costs are met, and, for that reason, the civil government grants to these corporations the right to escape a very important operating cost: taxes. The taxable business, however, is allowed to keep profits for the owners, distributing these profits in any way the owners decide. Charitable organizations pay for services rendered. Profit and loss corporations try to gain for the owners as much profit as possible. Gains from the first are limited, ultimately, by civil law. Gains from the second, except in the case of regulated monopolies or semi-monopolies, are not. The tax laws recognize a distinction between a return for service and a return on investment. Charity is not business.